In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to use the landscape grass output node to procedurally spawn foliage on your terrain. This will allow you quickly and almost effortlessly spawn grass, trees, rocks, or any other static mesh on a specific terrain texture. So let's begin. First, let me briefly cover the setup I'm using. I am using the time of day map template that's available when you go to File, New, and Time of Day. I've added post-process volume, adjusted the exposure by setting minimum and maximum brightness both to 1, and made this volume universal by enabling unbound. This removes the exposure fade-in effect that you see when you spawn into the map, into your environment, and basically disables eye adaptation of auto exposure. I also changed the directional light intensity and increased it to 5. By default in the map it's set to 1, and by adjusting the auto exposure I needed to compensate it by adjusting the directional light intensity and increasing it. I also have a landscape already created, and it contains very subtle hills. This height map was created in Photoshop using the clouds filter with few adjustments. The size of this height map is 2017 by 2017, so it's about 2 square kilometers. And after I imported the height map into UE4, I reduced its Z-scale to 50, creating the smooth field planes. And this is what the height map looks like. Alright, now we are ready to begin creating the material and using the grass node output. So first we need to have a material that we can use on the landscape. So instead of telling you to go look at another tutorial, I'm going to create one really quick, very basic, and we're going to add in the grass node functionality into it. And then you could expand on this material to create a full, more complete master landscape material. I'm going to go into my materials folder, and in here I'm going to create a new folder where I will keep the tutorial material and all files associated with this map. So go to Add New, Material, and name it. Now I'm going to double click on it and go into the material editor. So first we need a couple of textures to use. You can use any texture you want, but I'm going to use the starter content textures because they're readily available with every new project you create. But if you choose to use Quixel's bridge textures, there's a lot of great textures to use instead. I'm going to create a 2-texture landscape material, so I need 2 textures. And the ones that I'm going to use is this T ground grass and T ground gravel. And I need the albedo and the normal map for both. So I'm going to select all 4 of these and left click, hold and drag right into the material editor. And then I'm going to arrange them. So I'm going to put grass at the top, dirt below, and then do the same thing for normal maps. And I have to make sure that the normal map for the grass is above, just like it is for the albedo for the color. This way I can always tell that the grass is on top and the dirt is on the bottom, since it's very difficult to tell by looking at it when you are looking at the normal maps. Next we need a landscape layer blend node. So I'm going to right click in the empty space to bring up the search bar and search for landscape. And I'm going to insert this landscape layer blend. Right now it's empty, so we need to create 2 elements, 2 layers, 1 for each texture. So I'm going to click on this plus icon 2 times and open these up. So first you need to define a layer name, and this can be anything you want. So I'm going to name mine grass texture. For blend type, I'm going to set it to LB weight blend, and it's outside the scope of this tutorial to go over what each of them do. But if you want to learn more, take a look at UE4 Fundamentals Volume 2 course, Landscape Essentials. And then there I go over for what each of these mean and how to use them. For preview weight, I'm going to set it to 1. And this just defines a preview weight inside this viewport. So it doesn't affect the functionality of the material. And then for the second layer, I'm going to name it Dirt Texture. Blend type to the same one, LB weight blend, and preview to 1.0. With that set, we now need to connect our texture samples into their appropriate layer blend inputs. The grass will go to the first one, grass texture input, and the dirt will go into the second one. And then the output of the layer blend will go into the base color of the material. And then we need to duplicate this layer blend node for the normal maps. So I'm going to select it, press Ctrl W to duplicate, move it down, and connect the normal maps the same way. And then the output of layer blend will go into the normal map input of the material. And one more thing we need for these textures is to control tiling. I'm going to right click on the empty space and search for landscape. And I'm going to insert landscape layer chords. And I'm going to use the same one node to control tiling for all textures. I'm going to change the mapping scale to 5 and then connect the output into the UV input of every texture sample. Then we need a few more things to finish this off. I'm going to insert a cancel one vector, hold 1 and left click, and I'm going to use this first one and connect it into metallic input. Value of 0 will mean that this material is not metallic, and by default it's already set to 0, but I like to do this just as a visual reminder. Then I'm going to insert another cancel one vector, hold 1 and left click again, and change the default value to 0.5, and connect it into the specular input. The specularity of the material is by default at 0.5, but later on we're going to turn this into a parameter so we can lower and remove the shiny glare on the landscape. And I'll show you what that looks like later, but right now we're just going to have it at its default value of 0.5. And then one more cancel one vector with a default value of 0.9 and connect it into roughness. This will make the material more rough and not very shiny, not very reflective. And for grass and dirt, 0.8, 0.9 is a good value. Anything closer to 0 will be not very rough and more shiny, and closer to 1 will be very rough, not shiny, and not very reflective. Alright, this is our basic landscape material. I'm going to hit apply, save, and let's apply it onto our terrain, onto our landscape. I'm going to select the landscape, and then go find our material. And then with the landscape selected, in the details panel you will have landscape material slot. So I'm just going to left click, hold and drag the material right into here and apply it onto our terrain. And the landscape will turn black, which is normal because we need to create layer infos. So I'm going to switch over to the modes panel, use the drop down menu here, shift 2. And if you're using UE4 version below 4.25, the shortcut was shift 3. And in 4.25 and later it has changed to shift 2. With the landscape mode open, I'm going to switch over to the paint tab, and then you'll see the 2 layers we created inside the material. Before we can do anything with them, we need to create layer infos for each texture, for each layer. So I'm going to click on this plus icon, and there's going to be 2 options, and there's quite a difference between the 2. And if you want to know more about them, I go into more detail in the Fundamentals Volume 2 tutorial course. But for simplicity right now, we're going to choose the first one, Weight Blended Layer Normal, and the menu will pop up asking us where do we want to save the layer information. And by default it will create a folder for you, so I'm not going to do anything, I'm not going to change it. And I'm going to click OK. As soon as you do that, you will see that layer, that texture appear on the entire landscape. This is our base texture layer. And then I'm going to do the same thing for the dirt layer. Create layer info, choose Weight Blended Layer Normal, and then click OK on the menu. So we have grass applied to the entire landscape. But if you wanted to have a different texture instead, if you right click on each texture layer here, you'll have an option to fill layer or clear layer. And you can clear a texture or you can fill with a texture. But we are going to keep the grass. Let's go back to select mode and go back into the material editor. We are now ready to insert the landscape grass output node. I'm going to come down here in the bottom, and in the empty space I'm going to right click and search for grass. And we want to insert this landscape grass output. By default it will have a first element named grass, but don't let that confuse you because you can rename it to anything you want and it doesn't have to be grass. It's just a default name given. So what we need to do is we need to set which texture layer that we want to spawn our grass or our foliage onto. And to do that, we only have an input into this grass node, into this first element, and we have no outputs. So that means we can only connect an input into it, and that would be it. So in order to define which texture layer we want, we need a landscape layer sample. So I'm going to right click and search for landscape, and we need this node right here, landscape layer sample. Right now it's empty, and we need to define a parameter name by entering name of the layer from the layer blend node. So this basically will define a static mesh to spawn on that specific texture layer. So for this first one, I want to enter grass texture. And it has to be entered with the exact same spelling as the name in the layer blend node. And this is very important. So you're basically telling the grass node that we are sampling the texture from the layer blend node by using the layer sample node. Then let's take the sample layer output and connect it into the grass input. And now we have our first grass node output defined. By itself right now, it will not spawn anything. So if I select the grass node, we have a grass type that is empty. And this is the important part of the grass node. This is where you define a grass type actor which sets which static meshes to spawn on that texture layer. So that's going to be our next step. We need to create a grass type and then define the static meshes to spawn. Let's do that now. I'm going to hit apply, save, and let's go back into the content browser. I'm going to navigate back into our materials folder and into the grass node folder. And in here, this is where I'm going to create and save the landscape grass type. But you can save it anywhere you want inside your project. So it doesn't have to be all inside your material. Then I'm going to go to add new, foliage, and select landscape grass type. This will create an empty actor. So I'm going to go ahead and rename it. And again, for this, you can rename it to anything you want. I'm going to name mine landscape grass type, grass. And then I'm going to go back into the material editor and select the grass node. In here on the grass type, I can use the drop down menu and choose the landscape grass type. But I already have a few in this project, so I want to make sure I'm selecting the right one. I'm going to go back into the content browser and select the actor that I just created. Then back into the material editor with the grass node selected, I'm going to click on use selected asset from the content browser. Let's save. And back into our map, nothing will happen. First, before we get started assigning a mesh to spawn, you want to make sure you are in real-time mode. So you can click on this or use the drop-down menu to make sure you have real-time enabled. Now we have no meshes, no grass spawning on our landscape, and that is because we haven't assigned any. So this is our next step now. To do this, you need to double-click on the landscape grass type to open up its properties. Then add your first element by clicking on this plus icon, and then expand this element. These are going to be your settings for your first spawn static mesh. And you need to assign a static mesh right here under grass mesh. So you can use the drop down menu to search for what you're looking for. But before we do that, it's very important that you should lower the grass density to a lower number than 400, because it's going to spawn meshes and it could slow down your system depending on what you choose. So I always lower this to somewhere around 25. And now let's assign our static mesh. So if you have a static mesh you want to use, you should use that instead. What I'm going to use is grass from the open world demo that was released by Epic Games a few years back. There's a lot of foliage, trees, grass, rocks, bushes that you can use, and they look pretty good. And they're freely available inside the marketplace, and you can download that and add it to your project. So I already have it added, so I'm going to go into the open world demo folder, and it's named kite demo. Then it's going to be inside environments, then inside foliage, grass, and field grass. And I'm going to go ahead and select this static mesh right here, SM field grass 01. And then I'm going to left click, hold and drag, and drop it right into the grass mesh entry. And as soon as you do that, it will begin to spawn the static mesh. So now we can go back to grass density and begin to increase it to a higher number. So I'm going to go all the way up to 250. One thing to note that's very important, the higher the grass density, the more static meshes you are spawning. So you don't want to go too much, too high, because it's going to begin to slow down your environment. And especially if you begin to add more static meshes to spawn. So I'm going to go ahead and lower to 200. And eventually I'm going to lower even more. And you can see it doesn't look very good. We can see patches of the landscape below the grass. And there are two things going on here. And I will tell you how to fix the terrain texture to match the grass you are spawning. But right now, let's deal with the density issue first. I don't want to keep increasing the density and the number of static meshes spawning. So a good trick I like to use for grass is increase the scale of X, Y, and Z to a higher number. So I'm going to increase max on X, Y, and Z to 3. And it will make the grass appear more denser than it actually is. And now I can even go back and lower the grass density while still maintaining that fullness that there's grass everywhere. And again, we don't have the terrain matching the grass yet, but once it does, it will look even better. But the most important part is from point of view of the player. It seems like a very dense grass spawning everywhere, and those empty patches are harder to spot. So you'll have to play around with this, with the grass density, find the right value, and change the scale on X, Y, and Z, and find a happy medium between the two. The next option we have is Use Grid. I usually leave this on, and with it enabled, it uses one jitter grid sequence for placement. And with it disabled, it uses another. And if you have this enabled, the placement jitter right below it will be available for you to tweak and change. So I usually just keep this on, as it offers more variety. Then the two options below that, you have Start Call Distance and End Call Distance. These control where static meshes begin to fade out and stop rendering, and where they completely stop rendering. So these two values help with performance. Start Call Distance is the distance where the instances or the static meshes will begin to fade out. But by itself, Start Call Distance does nothing and will not change anything unless you use a node per instance fade amount inside your material. So you can just ignore this completely and not use it, unless you use that node inside the material. But End Call Distance is very important and controllable. This will set where your static meshes will stop spawning. So by changing this amount, you can see the static meshes will stop spawning, and this is set in Unreal units. So for this grass, I'm going to set End Call Distance to 20,000. Then we have Scale, which will change the size of your meshes on X, Y, and Z. And I like to use Scale alongside with grass density, as I've mentioned before. This allows me to bring the grass density down while scaling the meshes up, to make it look like they are spawning way more than they are. And then you have Scaling, where you can change the scale uniformly, freestyle, or lock on X and Y. And the next two options we have are Random Rotation and Align to Surface. Random Rotation is self-explanatory, and it will randomly rotate meshes to make them appear to rotate more randomly, and I usually keep this on. Align to Surface, this option is very useful. Right now we have it enabled, so the grass will spawn and align to the surface, to the terrain. Now if I disable this, to see its effect, I'm going to go ahead and scale the terrain back up to a larger value so we have more steeper hills. And then if I come over here where there's a steeper incline, I'm going to lower grass density so we're spawning less meshes, and it will allow you to see this better. So right now Align to Surface is enabled, and the grass is growing along with the normals of the terrain, and this is what you want. But if I go ahead and disable this, the meshes will no longer align to the surface, to the landscape. And you can see what's happening here, that the grass is no longer respecting the normals of the terrain, and it's just spawning facing up, horizontally. Now for grass, you want to align to surface and have it enabled. This will naturally spawn the grass and go with the surface of the terrain. But for trees, you would want to disable Align to Surface. So depending on what kind of mesh, what kind of foliage you are spawning, and then you would enable or disable this based on that. Now, as you work with foliage and you begin to add grass, trees, or any type of other static mesh, it's a bit difficult to tell the size of them and how large you should set scale X, Y, and Z, or how much grass density you should add. So I recommend that you insert a human reference scale into every scene that you create. So I already had the mannequin placed inside the scene. I'm gonna go ahead and delete it and navigate into the UE4 mannequin mobile. This is a free static mesh that you can use and place it inside every scene to help you judge the scale of everything you create. And when you tweak the properties for the grass to spawn, it will make more sense, it will be more clear, since now you have a human reference scale to compare and to judge against. And I will link a video in the description or within the blog post on how to add this mannequin into every project. So right now all we have is grass. Let's add a second type of static mesh to spawn alongside the grass. I'm gonna bring back the landscape grass type properties, and we're going to add a new element. And the mesh I'm going to use will be inside the kite demo folder, environments, foliage, and flowers. And before I add that into the grass mesh property, I'm going to lower the grass density to 100. Then left click, hold and drag the static mesh and add it in. Alright, so we have flowers being spawned within the grass. I'm going to lower the grass density now to maybe something like 10, maybe even lower to 5. And then I'm going to change the end call distance to 15,000. At this distance, the flowers will stop spawning. Then I'm going to adjust the scale on X, Y, and Z on max to 1.5 and keep everything else the same. Alright, it's looking pretty good. Let's add another element, an additional static mesh. So we'll have 3 grass and 2 different types of flowers. I'm going to add another element and use a different type of flower static mesh from the same project, the kite demo. I'm going to lower the grass density and then change scale X, Y, and Z minimum and maximum values to vary the static mesh size and keep everything else the same. I'm going to go ahead and spawn inside the map and run around and take a look from the player's point of view. Alright, it's looking very good. I'm very happy with this. So after adding 2 additional elements, we have some variety, some color being spawned along our grass. This pop in and out effect that you see based on the distance to the grass mesh, this has to do with level of detail that's set up by default for the grass static mesh and within the material. And there is a way to control at which distance level of detail switches to a cheaper version of the grass, but that would require to go into the asset itself and find the properties to control. So this has nothing to do with the properties in the landscape grass type, but more with the asset itself. And you'll find this very often in a lot of foliage meshes, that they will switch to a cheaper level of detail at a certain distance. Now, one thing that we do need to adjust and control is the terrain color that is not blending and matching our grass color. This is something we can't control, and I'm going to show you how. We need to go back into our material, and actually it's not going to be the color that we control for the terrain texture, but brightness and darkness of the texture. I'm going to create more space, specifically for the albedo grass and the dirt. So to control darkness and brightness of the texture, we need a multiply node, hold M and left click, and then we need a custom 1 node. Hold 1 and left click. I'm going to connect the custom 1 vector into multiply B and the grass RGB texture into multiply A. And then connect multiply into the layer blend node into layer grass texture. Now for the custom 1 vector, it's best if you convert it to a parameter and then adjust its value via material instance. So I'm going to right click on the custom 1 vector and choose convert to parameter, and I will give it a name, grass darken brighten, and you can rename this to anything you want. And I will give a default value of 1, which will be no change. And then I'm going to do the same thing for the dirt texture. And actually, to speed things up, I'm going to duplicate the multiply and the parameter vector. Select it, press Ctrl W to duplicate, move it down, and I need to rename the custom 1 vector parameter to dirt darken brighten. And then connect the texture sample RGB of the dirt into multiply A, and then the multiply will go into the layer blend for dirt texture. So now we can adjust the brightness and the darkness for grass and for the dirt. Let's save and go back into our map. And in order to adjust the darkness and the brightness of the texture, we need to create a material instance, which we haven't done yet. So for the landscape material, I'm going to right click on it and choose create material instance. And I'm going to keep the name that UE4 gives me. And now I need to apply this material instance onto the landscape, because right now we are using the material itself. So I'm going to select the landscape, in the details panel, scroll down, and then drag the material instance over the material slot and replacing it. And now if I double click on the material instance, it will open up the material instance editor, and we can begin to adjust the grass texture. Let's enable the property for grass darken brighten, and then lower below 1 to darken the texture. So if you go down to 0.2, you can see that the grass texture is darkened and it looks closer to the color of the grass. And in order to match it up even closer and more exact, I recommend that you switch to unlit mode to get rid of all lighting, so all you see is albedo color. So keep adjusting until you get it as close as you can, to the point where the grass is blending almost seamlessly with the texture underneath. Alright, I think that's close enough. Let's go back into the material and convert a few more vectors into a parameter so we can adjust them. The first one is going to be the specular property. I'm going to right click, convert to a parameter, and name it specular. The default is 0.5, so I'm going to leave it at that. And then we need ability to control the roughness for each texture. Now to do that, we need to duplicate the layer blend node. Select it, press Ctrl W, move it down, and we need parameters for each input, for grass and for dirt. Now if you had a roughness texture to use instead, you could use it here just like we did for the albedo and the normal map, but I found a constant vector works just as good. And it's a quick workaround if you don't have a roughness texture to use. So I'm going to take this constant vector, place it over here, convert it to a parameter, and then rename it to grass roughness. Then duplicate it by pressing Ctrl W with it selected, and change the parameter name to dirt roughness. The default values for both will be at 0.9, which is not very rough, and that's what I want to start with. Then connect the grass roughness into the layer grass texture input, and the dirt roughness into the layer dirt texture input, and the layer blend output into the roughness of the material. Alright, that's looking pretty good. Let's go ahead, save, and begin to adjust these properties. The first property I want to adjust is the specularity. If I look at the landscape towards the sun, towards the direction of light, you will see that the texture on the terrain is very glossy. It's very specular. So the default value of 0.5 does not look good on the terrain. But if I turn that down to a lower value, it won't be as specular anymore and it actually looks better. So 0.5 by default is too much. So for landscapes, I usually turn this down to 0.2. And in this case, 2.15. And now I can readjust the grass darken and brighten value to better match the grass color. Since I've turned down the specularity, I can be more accurate. And then for the roughness values we added, you can adjust them the same way, which I'm not going to do in this video. So if I spawn inside the map and run around, we have the grass texture color and the terrain texture blended very nicely and are more cohesive and look like they're part of the environment. Now I'm going to bring back the landscape mode paint menu. And I'm going to paint in the dirt. And you'll see that we have the grass being spawned on the grass texture. And as soon as I begin to paint the dirt texture layer, it will paint in the dirt and begin to remove the foliage grass. So this is the power from having a grass node, where you can assign a set of static meshes to spawn automatically on that texture. And if you paint another texture, you can either remove and have no static meshes being spawned on the new texture, or you can have a different set of static meshes being spawned on a new texture layer. And I'm going to show you how to do that in a bit. So in order to make the dirt texture match a little bit better, I'm going to bring back the material instance editor and darken the dirt texture. So now it looks a lot better. For the last part of this video, I'm going to show you how to add a way to spawn additional static meshes that are different than on the first grass texture layer and the ones for the dirt texture layer. So this way you have some variety of what you want to spawn depending on the terrain texture. For this we need a second landscape grass type. So you could go to add new and add a whole new landscape grass type like we did before. But to speed things up, I like to duplicate an existing one already and then just rename it. Then double click on this new one to bring up the properties, and I'm going to delete 2 elements out of the 3. So we're just left with 1. And this speeds things up because I don't have to create an element, assign a static mesh and define all the properties. I just keep the properties from the previous one and then just change the static mesh and update few properties. So we have our second landscape grass type with just 1 element. And we'll adjust all the properties in a bit. Right now we need to go back into the material editor and set up our grass node. I'm gonna select the grass node and we need to add a second element in it. I'm gonna come over here in the details panel and click on the plus icon to add a second element and give it a name. I'm going to name it dirt, but you can name it anything you want. And then we need to sample a layer. So I'm going to right click on the empty space and search for landscape, and we need to insert landscape layer sample. The parameter name has to be exact from the layer blend node. So I'm going to double check really quick, and it's dirt texture. So with the sample layer selected, in the details panel, I'm going to give a parameter name dirt texture, and then connect it into the grass dirt input. And now we need to assign a landscape grass type to the second grass node input, to the second element. So I'm going to go back into the content browser, select the second landscape grass type, the dirt, then back in the material editor, make sure the grass node is selected, and in the details panel for the second element for the dirt, assign the selected asset from the content browser. Click Save, and let's go back into the map. Let's take a look at our dirt texture, and we are already spawning some flowers that we had set up from the previous duplicated landscape grass type. So it's working. I'm going to bring up the properties for the landscape grass type, and the first thing we want to change is the grass mesh. So here you can use anything you want. I'm going to search for rock and filter by static mesh, and assign a static mesh rock that I would like to use. I'm going to adjust grass density and change scale on X, Y, and Z. If I don't like how this rock looks, I just swap it with another static mesh and replace it. So there you have it. This is a great quick way to add foliage onto your landscapes automatically and procedurally. And you don't have to stick with small static meshes such as grass, flowers, or rocks. You can spawn trees. So if I bring up the first landscape grass type we had and decide to, let's say, switch out one of the flowers to a tree. So I'm going to go ahead and search for trees, find the one that I would want to use, and just replace it. Now, of course, like I've mentioned, when you work with trees, make sure you lower the grass density so it doesn't overtake your entire viewport and slow your entire computer. And again, for trees, you may want to disable Align to Surface property. So I love using the grass node, and it allows me to quickly, procedurally, and automatically spawn foliage on landscapes. Now, if this tutorial was overwhelming to you, and you have never created landscapes or landscape materials, then I recommend 2 courses to you that I created specifically to get you started sculpting landscapes, creating landscape materials, and painting textures on your terrain. I take you through the entire system from beginning to end and show you everything you need to know for how to create terrains using Unreal Engine 4. And this tutorial course is UE4 Fundamentals Volume 2 Landscapes Essentials. And once you've gone through that, I recommend you pick up Complete Guide to Auto Landscape Materials. This course will show you how to create a material that will automatically and procedurally texture your entire terrain, no matter what size it is. And you can texture huge open world landscapes in minutes. You can pick up both of these courses at worldofleveldesign.com/store and begin creating landscapes. So then you would have something to use the grass node on to spawn foliage automatically.